the summer of 1939, an American engineer smuggled 3 metal containers out of Nazi Germany. They weren't weapons, they weren't secret documents. They were just simple fuel cans. But those 3 cans would change the course of World War II. Because while the Allies were losing 40% of their fuel to leaking containers, while British victories in North Africa were collapsing because tanks ran out of gas, while men died because supply lines couldn't deliver fuel fast enough, the Germans had already solved the problem. They had the Jerrycan, a simple 20-litre fuel container that could do what no Allied container could. It didn't leak. It didn't break. It didn't need tools to open. And it would become so important to Allied victory that President Roosevelt himself would say, without it, the liberation of France would have been impossible. This is the story of how a humble fuel can become one of the most important pieces of equipment in the entire war. This is the story of German engineering genius, Allied incompetence, and one man's mission to steal a secret that would help win the war. This is the story of the Jerrycan. Let's begin. To understand why the Jerrycan mattered so much, we first need to understand just how badly the Allies were losing the fuel container war. And make no mistake, they were getting destroyed. Let's start with the British. In 1939, when World War II began, the British Army used 2 types of fuel containers. The first was a 2-gallon pressed steel can. It was strong, but expensive to make. The second was a 4-gallon tin container. It was cheap to produce, and there were plenty of them. But there was a problem. Actually, there were many problems. The 4-gallon cans were made from thin tin plate. They had crimped seams that split easily during transport. They were easily punctured by even minor damage. They had to be packed in wooden crates just to survive shipping. And worst of all, they leaked. Constantly. British soldiers hated these containers so much they gave them a nickname. The Flimsy. That's what they called it. The Flimsy. Because that's exactly what it was. Flimsy, unreliable, and dangerous. When the British Army went to fight in North Africa in 1940, the Flimsies became a disaster. Transport across the rough, rocky desert terrain meant the cans split open constantly. Fuel leaked everywhere. Ships carrying these containers had fuel sloshing in the bilges. Some ships caught fire and were lost. One quartermaster reported that he started with 70,000 gallons of fuel. By the time it reached the front lines, only 30,000 gallons remained. That's a loss of over 50%. And he was told that was actually a good result. General Auchinleck, commander of British forces in North Africa, estimated that the Flimsy containers led to the loss of 30% of all fuel between base and consumer. 30%. Just gone. Leaked away. Wasted. The British historian Desmond Young later wrote that no one who didn't serve in the desert could realize how much the difference between victory and defeat rested on the worst item of British equipment. The fuel container. British victories collapsed because tanks and planes literally ran out of gas. General Wavell defeated the Italians in 1940, but couldn't exploit his victory. No fuel. General Auchinleck pushed Rommel back in 1941, but the advance withered. No fuel. The Flimsies were killing the British war effort. But the British soldiers found one good use for them. They would cut the tops off, fill them with sand and gasoline, and light them on fire. They called it the Benghazi burner, a cooking stove. That was the best use anyone could find for British fuel containers. Now let's look at the Americans. The United States military in 1939 was using a World War I era fuel container. It was a 10-gallon cylindrical can with 2 screw closures. To use it, you needed a wrench to remove the cap. You needed a funnel to pour fuel in. You needed a separate spout to pour fuel out. That's 4 separate pieces, not including the can itself. It was heavy, awkward, and inefficient, and it also leaked. The American containers were better than the British Flimsies, but not by much. So this was the situation in 1939. The British had Flimsies that lost 30 to 50% of fuel in transport. The Americans had clunky World War I containers that needed tools and funnels. And the Germans had something else entirely. They had perfection. They had the Jerrycan. Adolf Hitler knew something that Allied commanders didn't fully understand. He knew that modern mechanized warfare required fuel. Lots of it. And he knew that if his panzer divisions couldn't get fuel quickly and efficiently, his entire strategy would collapse. Hitler's plan was blitzkrieg, lightning war, fast, overwhelming attacks using tanks, trucks, and aircraft. But blitzkrieg only works if you can keep your machines fueled. And that meant you needed a fuel container that could withstand combat conditions, that soldiers could move quickly, and that didn't waste a single drop of precious fuel. So Hitler ordered his engineers to design the perfect fuel container. Design it in secret, make it better than anything the enemy has, and make thousands of them before the war even starts. In 1937, the Müller engineering firm in Schwelm, Germany, was given the contract. The chief engineer was a man named Vinzenz Grünvogel, and Grünvogel created a masterpiece, the Wehrmacht Einheitskanister, the Armed Forces Unit canister, what we now call the Jerrycan. The specifications were precise. The can had to hold 20 liters. That's about 5.3 US gallons. A soldier had to be able to carry 2 full cans or 4 empty cans. It had to be stackable. It had to be leak-proof. It had to be easy to use, even in combat, even in the dark, even under fire. And it had to require no tools, no wrenches, no funnels, no separate parts. Grünvogel delivered all of that and more. The Jerrycan was made from 2 pieces of pressed steel, stamped and welded together at the seam. This made it incredibly strong. The weld ran around the middle of the can like the equator, making it virtually leak-proof. Between the 2 steel pieces was a plastic lining, the same material used to line steel beer barrels. This lining meant the can could carry gasoline, diesel, oil, or water without contamination. You could use the same can for fuel one day and drinking water the next. The can had 3 handles, not 1. 3. Why 3 handles? Because one person could carry 2 full cans at once, using the center handles. Or they could grab the outer handles and carry 4 empty cans. Or, in a bucket brigade, soldiers could pass cans down a line rapidly. One soldier would grab the far handle, hand it to the next soldier, who would grab the opposite handle. Fast, efficient, brilliant. The Jerrycan had ridges stamped into the sides. These weren't just for looks. They added structural strength, making the can rigid. And they allowed the liquid inside to expand and contract with temperature changes without bursting the can. The spout was built in. It was long enough that in many situations you didn't need a separate pouring spout. The cap used a cam lever mechanism. You could open it with one hand, even wearing gloves. No wrench needed. It had a rubber gasket that created an airtight seal. And the cap was designed so it couldn't be lost. There was even a small aluminum pin that locked the lever mechanism. And it was attached to the can with a welded detent, so it couldn't be fully removed. At the top of the can was an air chamber. This served 2 purposes. First, if the can was dropped in water or from a plane, it would float. Second, there was an air-breathing tube from the spout to this chamber. When you poured fuel, air flowed in through this tube, making the pour smooth and fast. No glugging, no spillage. The Germans even color-coded their jerrycans. Different colors meant different contents: fuel, oil, water. At a glance, soldiers could identify what was in each can. The entire design was genius. Simple, robust, efficient. And by 1939, Germany had stockpiled thousands of these cans in secret. They were ready for war. The Allies had no idea what was coming. In the summer of 1939, Europe was on the brink of war. Everyone knew it was coming. And in Berlin, an American engineer named Paul Pleiss was about to make a decision that would change the war. Pleiss worked for Ambibud Presswerk, a German auto body manufacturing company. It was the German branch of the American Bud Company, based in Philadelphia. Pleiss had been in Berlin for some time, working on manufacturing projects. But as tensions rose, he knew it was time to leave. Pleiss loved adventure, and he had an idea. He would build a car and drive it all the way to India. Over 11,000 kilometers, across Europe, the Middle East, and into India. He invited a German colleague to join him. The German engineer accepted. They bought a car chassis and built a custom body for it. They prepared for the journey of a lifetime. But then they realized a problem. They had no way to carry emergency water. If they broke down in the desert, they would die of thirst. The German engineer had an idea. He had security clearance at Berlin Tempelhof Airport, and he knew there were thousands of these new fuel containers stockpiled there. The Wehrmacht Einheitskanister. He went to the airport and took 3 of them. He mounted them under the car, and then he did something even more dangerous. He gave Pleiss the complete manufacturing specifications for the cans. On paper, everything, how they were made, how they were designed, every measurement, every detail. Why did he do this? We don't know for sure. Maybe he thought his American friend should have the information. Maybe he knew the design was too good to stay secret. Maybe he was committing treason. Or maybe he just didn't think it mattered. Whatever his reasons, he handed Pleiss the blueprints to one of Germany's secret weapons. And in the summer of 1939, Pleiss and his German friend drove out of Berlin with 3 jerrycans mounted under their car and the manufacturing plans in Pleiss's possession. They drove across 11 countries without incident. Through Poland, through Eastern Europe, through the Middle East, into India. The jerrycans performed flawlessly. They didn't leak. They didn't break. They carried water safely across thousands of kilometers of rough terrain. Pleiss was impressed. He realized these containers were far superior to anything the Allies had. He realized this could make a difference in the war that was about to start. But then, halfway across India, everything changed. Field Marshal Hermann Göring sent a plane to retrieve the German engineer. He was ordered back to Germany immediately. The German engineer had to leave. Before he flew home, he reminded Pleiss of the specifications he had given him. "Use them," he said. "Tell your military about these cans." Pleiss was now alone in India with a custom-built car, 3 German fuel containers, and complete manufacturing plans for what would become one of the most important pieces of equipment in the war. Pleiss knew he had something important, but he also knew that just telling people about it wouldn't work. He needed proof. He needed the actual cans. So he made a decision. He would ship his entire car back to the United States. Car and jerry cans together. But this was 1939. War had started in Europe. Shipping routes were dangerous. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic. So Pleiss took a roundabout route. He put the car in storage in Calcutta and flew back to the United States. Once home, he went straight to American military officials. He told them about the German fuel containers. He explained how superior they were. He showed them the manufacturing specifications. The officials looked at him and basically said thanks, but no thanks. The American military was convinced their World War I era 10-gallon cans were good enough. They didn't need some fancy German design. Pleiss couldn't believe it. He had just driven 11,000 kilometers across 11 countries. He had proof that these containers were revolutionary. And the American military didn't care. So Pleiss did something crazy. He arranged to have his entire car shipped from Calcutta to New York, via Turkey, around the Cape of Good Hope, across the Atlantic. The journey took months. The risk was enormous. But finally, in the summer of 1940, his car arrived in New York. The 3 jerrycans were still mounted underneath, intact and perfect. Pleiss immediately sent 1 jerrycan to Washington. Now they had to take him seriously. Right? Wrong. The War Department looked at the jerrycan. They examined it, and then they made one of the biggest mistakes of the early war. They decided it wasn't necessary. They would just update their World War I containers. That would be good enough. They sent the 1 jerrycan they had to Camp Holabird, Maryland. There, Army engineers were ordered to redesign it. And they did. Sort of. The Camp Holabird redesign was a disaster. They kept the handles, the size, and the shape. But they changed everything else. They replaced the welded seam with rolled seams. These were prone to leakage. They removed the plastic lining. Now it could only carry fuel, not water. They got rid of the cam lever cap. Now you needed a wrench to open it. They removed the air-breathing tube. Now it poured slowly and awkwardly, and you needed a funnel. They took a perfect design and ruined it. American soldiers and Marines who used these modified cans hated them. They leaked. They were difficult to use. They were nowhere near as good as the German original. Meanwhile, Pleiss still had 2 jerrycans left. And the war was getting worse. In April 1940, Germany invaded Norway. The Blitzkrieg was devastating. German forces overran Norwegian defenses in weeks, and British forces sent to help the Norwegians were quickly pushed back. But in the chaos of the battle, British soldiers started finding abandoned German equipment, including fuel containers, rectangular containers with 3 handles, containers that didn't leak, containers that were easy to use, containers that were far, far better than the Flimsies the British had. The British soldiers started calling them jerrycans. Jerry was British slang for Germans, so German cans became jerrycans. British troops started hoarding any jerrycans they could capture. They would use them instead of Flimsies whenever possible, because everyone in the field knew the truth. The only fuel container worth having was German. Word reached British commanders. This German fuel can was superior. We need to copy it. But they didn't have the manufacturing specifications. They didn't know exactly how it was made. Then in late 1940, Paul Pleiss traveled to London. British officers heard that an American engineer might know something about the German fuel containers. They asked him if he could help. Pleiss immediately ordered his 2nd jerrycan flown from the United States to London. When it arrived, British engineers examined it carefully. They reverse-engineered it, every detail, every measurement, every feature. And they decided to copy it exactly. Not modify it, not improve it, just copy it, because it was already perfect. But copying it and manufacturing it in quantity would take time. Time the British didn't have. Because in North Africa, the fuel container crisis was reaching catastrophic levels. Let's go to North Africa in 1941. The British 8th Army is fighting the German Afrika Korps under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. It's brutal desert warfare. Tanks, artillery, aircraft. And everything runs on fuel. The British are still using Flimsies. and the Flimsies are killing them. Literally. General Wavell had defeated the Italians in 1940. A stunning victory. But he couldn't exploit it. His tanks and aircraft ran out of fuel. The Flimsies had leaked away 30 to 50% of his fuel supplies. The advance stopped. The victory was wasted. General Auchinleck took over command. In 1941, he pushed Rommel's forces back. Another victory. But again, the fuel situation was catastrophic. Tanks that should have been chasing the enemy were sitting still, out of gas. Aircraft that should have been striking enemy positions were grounded. No fuel. Auchinleck later estimated that 30% of all British fuel was lost between the supply base and the front lines. 30%. Just leaked away. Tanks were destroyed because they ran out of fuel at crucial moments. Men were killed or captured because vehicles couldn't move. Ships were lost carrying Flimsies that leaked and caught fire. The overall loss, as one British officer wrote, was almost incalculable. Meanwhile, the Germans had jerrycans. Thousands of them. When Rommel's forces retreated, they left jerrycans behind. British soldiers would grab every single one they could find. They were worth more than gold. The British historian Desmond Young, who served in North Africa, later wrote this: "No one who did not serve in the desert can realize to what extent the difference between complete and partial success rested on the simplest item of our equipment and the worst." The fuel container. By 1942, General Bernard Montgomery took command of the 8th Army. Montgomery was a meticulous planner. He made sure he had enough supplies before he attacked. But even Montgomery struggled with the fuel situation. He used a combination of captured German jerrycans and British Flimsies. The Flimsies still leaked terribly. But Montgomery had enough jerrycans, captured from the enemy, to make the logistics work. In October 1942, Montgomery launched the Battle of El Alamein. It was a decisive British victory. Rommel was defeated and pushed back, and the British had just enough fuel to make it happen. Thanks in large part to captured German jerrycans. But the Americans were about to discover the hard way just how bad the Allied fuel container problem really was. In September 1942, 2 American quality control officers were sent to the Middle East. They were posted to American refineries in Egypt. Their job was to monitor fuel quality and logistics. One of those officers was named Richard Daniels. He was a chemical engineer and a commander in the U.S. Naval Reserve. When Daniels arrived in Cairo, he learned something shocking. The British were about to reject a new American-designed fuel container. The U.S. Navy had developed a new can and wanted the British to use it, but British forces in North Africa said no. Absolutely not. The only fuel container they wanted was the jerrycan, even though their only supply was captured German cans taken in battle. Daniels and his colleagues started investigating the fuel situation. What they found was horrifying. Fuel was being lost at an unbelievable rate, through spillage, through evaporation, through leaking containers. The Americans were using their modified Camp Holabird cans. These were the badly redesigned jerrycans with rolled seams and no lining. They leaked constantly. The British were using Flimsies. Even worse. Daniels and his colleague visited fuel depots at the rear of Montgomery's army. They saw fuel sloshing in the bilges of ships. They saw containers split open and useless. They saw thousands of gallons of fuel just gone, wasted. They sent a cable back to Washington. It was alarming. They reported that 40% of all gasoline sent to Egypt was being lost through spillage and evaporation. 40%. The cable said a detailed report would follow. Actually, the 40% figure was a guess. Daniels admitted this later. It was intended to provoke alarm. And it worked. A cable came back from Washington immediately, requesting confirmation. Daniels and his colleague went back to the depots. They did the calculations properly this time, and they found the guess wasn't far off. The real number was somewhere between 30 and 50%, depending on the route and the containers used. It was catastrophic. They sent back a detailed report, and they recommended something radical. Cancel the new American fuel container under development. Copy the German Jerrycan exactly. Don't modify it, don't improve it, just copy it. The report landed on desks in Washington like a bomb. Could this really be true? Could a simple fuel container really be this important? The answer was yes, and the proof was about to become undeniable. Finally, the American military started to listen. The new American fuel container under development was cancelled. The Camp Holabird design was quietly phased out. Instead, production ramped up for a proper copy of the German Jerrycan. Not a modified version, not an improved version, an exact copy. But there was a problem. The British had already started manufacturing jerrycans, and they had a head start. So the Allies made an agreement. Britain would produce all the jerrycans needed for the invasion of Europe. British factories in the UK and the Middle East went into full production. By early 1943, 2 million British manufactured jerrycans were sent to North Africa. By early 1944, British factories in the Middle East were producing millions more. The United States also started manufacturing jerrycans. By May 1945, over 19 million jerrycans were required to support US forces in the European theater alone. 19 million, and that's just for American forces. The Marines, practical as always, ordered jerrycans that were exact copies of the German original. They refused to use the inferior Camp Holabird design. The Soviets also copied the German design exactly. They made it their standard liquid container, and they still use that design today. In fact, every NATO country still uses jerrycans based on the original German design. Over 80 years later, it's still the standard. But having millions of jerrycans was one thing. Using them in combat was another. And what happened next would prove just how crucial these simple containers really were. June 6, 1944. D-Day. Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy and began the liberation of Europe. In the first hours, fuel was brought ashore in jerrycans. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. In the first weeks after D-Day, the Allied advance was slower than planned. Fighting through the hedgerows of Normandy took time, but by late July, the breakout began. Operation Cobra. American forces punched through German lines and began racing across France. General George Patton's Third Army was unleashed. His tanks covered astonishing distances. 50 kilometers in a day. 100 kilometers. Patton was moving faster than the German Blitzkrieg of 1940. But moving fast meant one thing. Fuel. Massive amounts of fuel. And the fuel had to come forward in jerrycans. The Allies set up a logistics operation called the Red Ball Express. It was a circular convoy system using about 6,000 trucks. Most were GMC CCKW 2.5-ton trucks. The famous Deuce and a Half. These trucks ran day and night, bringing supplies forward from the Normandy beaches to the front lines. Many trucks carried nothing but jerrycans of fuel. A single Deuce and a Half could carry 875 US gallons of fuel loaded in jerrycans. The Red Ball Express operated from August 25th to November 16th, 1944. It carried about 12,500 tons of supplies per day. Much of that was fuel, in jerrycans. Without the jerrycans, the entire system would have collapsed. Imagine trying to do this with Flimsies, containers that lost 30 to 50% of their fuel. containers that split and leaked and caught fire. It would have been impossible. The liberation of France would have stalled. Patton's advance would have stopped. The war would have dragged on. But the jerrycans worked. They delivered fuel efficiently. They stacked perfectly in trucks. Soldiers could unload them quickly using bucket brigades. The three-handle design meant cans moved down the line fast. The cam lever caps meant no tools needed, even in the dark, even under fire. The air-breathing tube meant fast, smooth pouring, no spillage, no waste. The welded seams meant no leaks. Every drop of fuel reached the front. Patton's tanks kept moving. The German army couldn't stop them. By September 1944, Allied forces were deep into France. They liberated Paris. They pushed toward Belgium. They approached the German border. And the entire advance was fueled by jerrycans. But there was a problem. Jerrycans were being lost, not destroyed, not used up, just lost, thrown away, abandoned. Soldiers would empty a jerrycan, drop it, and keep moving forward. In theory, empty cans were supposed to be returned. In practice, that almost never happened. The losses were staggering. In October 1944 alone, 3.5 million jerrycans were reported lost. 3.5 million. In 1 month. At one point in Courgand, 1944, the fuel shortage got so bad that Patton's advance actually stopped. Not because fuel didn't exist. It existed in huge quantities in the rear areas. But they couldn't bring it forward because there weren't enough jerrycans to carry it. The advance ground to a halt while more cans were rushed forward. The Allied command was desperate. They offered cash rewards to French civilians for returning empty jerrycans. French schoolchildren were sent out to collect abandoned cans. About 1 million cans were recovered this way, but millions more were never found. Today, if you go to Normandy, you can still find World War II dated jerrycans for sale in shops. They're everywhere. Souvenirs from the liberation. Evidence of the sheer scale of the logistics operation. By November 1944, the Red Ball Express was stood down. The port of Antwerp had been captured. Railways were restored. The supply lines became more efficient. But for months, the jerrycan had been the critical link in the chain. It had kept the Allied armies moving. It had delivered the fuel that liberated France. And President Franklin Roosevelt himself acknowledged it. In late 1944, Roosevelt made a public statement. He said this: "Without these cans, it would have been impossible for our armies to cut their way across France at a lightning pace which exceeded the German blitzkrieg of 1940. The President of the United States, crediting a fuel container. Think about that for a moment. Not a tank, not a plane, not a secret weapon. A fuel can. A simple stamped steel container with 3 handles and a cam lever cap. That's what Roosevelt said won the race across France. And he was right. Let's step back and look at the bigger picture. The jerrycan wasn't just a good design. It was a case study in how small things can have massive consequences in war. Hitler understood something fundamental. Wars are won by logistics, not just by tanks and guns and planes, but by the ability to get fuel, ammunition, food, and water to the front lines efficiently. The Germans knew their blitzkrieg strategy depended on fuel. Fast-moving panzer divisions needed constant refueling. So they designed the perfect fuel container. They made thousands of them before the war even started. They kept the design secret, and when the war began, the jerrycan gave them a massive logistical advantage. Meanwhile, the Allies were losing 30 to 50% of their fuel to leaking containers. British victories in North Africa collapsed because tanks ran out of gas. American advances stalled because fuel couldn't be delivered. Men died. Battles were lost, all because of bad fuel containers. When the Allies finally copied the Jerrycan, everything changed. Montgomery defeated Rommel at El Alamein. American forces raced across France. Soviet forces pushed into Germany. And all of them used Jerrycans. The Allies produced millions of them. British factories, American factories, Soviet factories, all copying the exact same German design, because it was perfect. And over 80 years later, we're still using the same design. The Jerrycan is still the standard military fuel container for NATO. It's still used by the United Nations. It's still manufactured in massive quantities. Civilians use them for camping, overlanding, emergency supplies. You can buy one right now for $20 to $60. The design hasn't changed, because it doesn't need to change. Vinzenz Grunvogel got it right in 1937. 2 pressed steel halves welded together, 3 handles, cam lever cap, air chamber, breathing tube, stamped ridges for strength. It was perfect then, it's perfect now, and it probably saved millions of lives in World War II. Now let's talk about what this story teaches us. Because the Jerrycan is more than just a piece of military history. It's a lesson in design, in logistics, and in how wars are really won. First, the importance of details. The Jerrycan wasn't revolutionary technology, it was just stamped steel. But every single detail was thought through. The 3 handles for different carrying options, the cam lever cap that worked with gloves, the air-breathing tube for smooth pouring, the ridges for strength and temperature expansion, the plastic lining for multiple uses. Every detail mattered. And together, those details created something perfect. Second, the danger of arrogance. The American military had a sample Jerrycan in 1940. They looked at it and decided their World War I design was good enough. They were wrong. And that arrogance cost the Allies dearly. When they finally swallowed their pride and copied the German design exactly, the logistics improved dramatically. Sometimes the best move is to admit someone else got it right. Third, the power of logistics. Historians love to talk about tanks and battles and generals, but wars are won by the ability to supply armies, fuel, ammunition, food, water. If you can't get these things to the front lines efficiently, you lose. The Jerrycan was a logistics solution, and it changed the entire war. Fourth, the value of preparation. The Germans had thousands of Jerrycans stockpiled before the war started. They understood what they would need. They prepared. They kept it secret. And when the war began, they had a massive advantage. The Allies had to play catch-up for years. And fifth, good design lasts. The Jerrycan design from 1937 is still in use today. Still manufactured. Still the standard. Because when you get something truly right, it doesn't need to be replaced. It just works. Forever. There's one more part of this story that deserves attention. Paul Pleiss, the American engineer who smuggled the Jerrycans out of Germany. What happened to him? The truth is, we don't know for sure. After the war, Pleiss disappeared from the historical record. There's very little official documentation about him. Some historians think his road trip story was a cover. Maybe he was a spy. Maybe he was working for American intelligence. Maybe the whole trip to India was planned from the start as a way to smuggle the Jerrycan plans out of Germany. Or maybe he really was just an engineer who went on an adventure and happened to recognize the value of what he had. We'll probably never know the full truth. What we do know is that his German colleague gave him complete manufacturing specifications. That was an act of treason. If the Nazis had found out, the German engineer would have been executed. Why did he do it? Again, we don't know. Maybe he knew the design was too good to stay secret. Maybe he thought it would help end the war faster. Maybe he just wanted to help his American friend. Or maybe he never imagined it would matter as much as it did. But it did matter. Those 3 jerrycans and those manufacturing plans changed history. When the British copied the design in 1940, when the Americans finally adopted it in 1943, when millions of jerrycans rolled off factory lines and were used to liberate Europe, Paul Plyce's road trip across 11 countries became one of the most important journeys of the war. And yet there's almost no official record of it. Why? Some historians think American military leadership was embarrassed. They had rejected the jerrycan in 1940. They had insisted their own designs were better. They had been proven completely wrong. So when the jerrycan became crucial to Allied victory, maybe they didn't want to talk about how they got it. Maybe they downplayed the story, changed the name, called it the Blitzcan. Anything to avoid admitting they had copied German engineering. Whatever the reason, the story of Paul Plyce and his 3 jerrycans has been mostly forgotten. But it shouldn't be, because it's a story about how small decisions can have massive consequences, how one person can make a difference, and how sometimes the most important weapons of war aren't weapons at all. They're simple tools that work perfectly. The jerrycan saved World War II. That might sound like an exaggeration, but it's not. Without it, British forces in North Africa would have kept losing 30 to 50% of their fuel. Rommel might have won. Without it, the Allied invasion of Europe would have failed. Patton's advance would have stalled. The liberation of France would have been impossible. President Roosevelt said so himself. Without these cans, the lightning advance across France could not have happened. The war would have dragged on. More men would have died. The outcome might have been different. But the Allies did have the jerrycan. They copied the German design. They manufactured millions of them. And they used them to win the war. Today, the jerrycan is still everywhere. Military bases around the world, camping supply stores, overlanding vehicles, emergency supply kits, that distinctive rectangular shape, those 3 handles, that cam lever cap. It's the same design from 1937, because it's perfect. And perfect designs last forever. So the next time you see a jerrycan, remember the story. Remember Vinzenz Grünvogel, the German engineer who designed it. Remember Paul Plyce, the American who smuggled it out of Nazi Germany. Remember the British soldiers who hoarded captured German cans because they were so much better than their own. Remember the millions of jerrycans that fueled the liberation of Europe. Remember that wars aren't just won with tanks and guns. They're won with logistics, with supply lines, with the ability to get fuel to the front lines efficiently. And remember that sometimes the most important invention of an entire war is something as simple as a 20-liter steel can with 3 handles.